Hi there, I'm Jack from Next Wave Politics, and I'm really lucky today to be joined for an interview with Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats. Right, I just want to start, where you came from in politics. So, what was it that inspired you to get into politics in the first place?
Well, it was a combination of things. I mean, my father was very political, but he was very right wing. He would probably be regarded as UKIP today. So we started debating and arguing when I was a teenager, and I took an opposite view on, the British Empire. He was very pro-British Empire, all that kind of thing. So I learned to develop a certain sort of debating technique, really, just arguing with him. And then I went to universities at Cambridge and got involved initially in the Liberal Club, and then in the union, the debating union. So I got involved in politics that way. I think there were two particular things later which got me actively involved. Well, one was I went to live in Glasgow. I got involved in some of the issues in the city around, bad housing, protests of shipbuilding workers and so on. And I got drawn into active Labour politics. I had been Liberal at university. And, they encouraged me to stand for Parliament, which I did in my mid-20s, and to stand for the council in Glasgow. And I got onto Glasgow City Council as a Labour councillor and got heavily involved in a lot of the big issues of the day in that way. And the second was I had married, my wife Olympia was a Kenyan Nation. We had a lot of problems with her family and my family, and we got involved in the anti-racism kind of movements, anti-apartheid and so on at that time. So that was the other dimension of my kind of early political involvement.
Okay, and actually, I know that your career as a politician actually came before the formation of the Liberal Democrats as a party, because if you were a Labour councillor and then you joined the Social Democratic Party, which is a party that broke off from Labour.
The SDP and the Liberals were the forerunners of the Lib Dem, and we had an alliance, and I stood for the alliance in 1983 and 87 in the elections in York, my hometown. So yeah, I mean, in a way, the Lib Dems formally merged in 88, 89, I think it was. But actually, the Lib Dems existed before that as an alliance, and that was what I joined when the Labour Party had its civil war in the early years.
Yeah, and you didn't actually enter Parliament until you were, is it 54 to enter Parliament? That was as a Liberal Democrat candidate in Twickenham.
I came in 1997, which was 30 years after I'd first been adopted as a candidate in Glasgow, and at my fifth attempt, because I'd stood once in Glasgow, twice in York, and then this was my second attempt in Twickenham. So it was quite a long road.
And do you think once you got into Parliament that your experience that you'd had of 30 years being a councillor benefited the actions you'd made in Parliament?
Yes, I think, I mean, basically, one of the points I often make to young people who are interested in going into politics is that, getting into Parliament, there's an awful lot of luck, actually. It's been in the right place at the right time. And for those 30 years, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I give priority to my family and the career I was developing as an economist, international economist in policy issues, international development. So I thought actually I was never going to get in, and I was, developing another life. So when I did get in, I had a lot of experience. I mean, I taught in universities, been involved in reasonably senior position in the civil service, done a lot of policy analysis in different sort of context, and I had a reasonably settled personal life, other than the fact that my wife was very ill. But in other respects, sort of came with a kind of hinterland of experience, which is quite useful in politics.
And actually, it was 10 years in when you were being an MP that you were acting leader of the Lib Dems for a while. And
Yes.
after Menzies Campbell stepped down, why did you not go for the leadership? Because I think you were a big heavyweight at that time in the Liberal Democrats.
Well, there were several reasons. Basically, what happened, Ming Campbell was a very good man in many ways, but was seen by the party as a kind of as a sort of temporary stand-in. His opinion poll ratings weren't good, and there was a sort of move to get on with the next generation. My problem was that although I was had a good reputation and so on, I was the same generation as Ming Campbell, and the party activists, I think, wanted somebody new. So there was a competition between Nick Clegg and Chris Huhne. They had already lined up most of the nominations of members of parliament. I didn't have the support then, so I just got on with the job of being acting leader, and I think made a reasonably good job of it.
Yeah, and you're probably going on from that in 2010 when you had that really dramatic three-way election between Labour, the Lib Dems, and Conservatives. You then became business secretary in the coalition from 2010 to 2015. What are you most proud of doing in that position as business secretary?
Well, it was the sort of highlight of my, political career. Yeah, and I did a lot of things. I think the first was a sort of rather general thing that, although I wasn't initially very happy going into a coalition with the Conservatives, we had a stable government that worked, delivered a lot of things, and my participation was quite an important factor in making the government work. And people now look back on it as one of Britain's better governments in modern times. So I made a substantial contribution to that merely by sticking with it. But in terms of the job itself, I suppose the things that I did that were most substantial were launching the industrial strategy, starting the British Business Bank, the Green Investment Bank, putting through quite a lot of legislation on social rights, parental leave, flexible working, action on zero hours contracts. I was heavily involved in a lot of the development of innovation and science. I started the Catapult Network, which has become quite an important part of the science infrastructure now. So I did a lot of practical things. We got through a lot of legislation. It was a period of stable government, and of course we stopped the Tories doing a lot of bad things. I mean, they wanted to, in my area, more or less outlaw trade unions, which I stopped. Weaken labour legislation. They wanted to take much deeper cuts in further education. Whereas I was pushing ahead with apprenticeships, for example. So we did a lot of good things and stopped a lot of bad things.
Yeah, and on the same token, or on the other side of the coin, if you could go back and change anything that you did during your time as business secretary, what would you go and change?
Well, I think part of the problem was that there was a kind of structural weakness in the government, that Liberal Democrats were only 1 in 6 of the ministers, which represented our relative strengths in Parliament, but didn't represent our relative strengths in the country. So we were heavily outgunned on almost every issue, and I was fighting a kind of rearguard action rather than being able to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. So I think in terms of redoing the coalition, I think the Lib Dems arguably should have taken a rather tougher line on voting reform and having a bigger stake in the cabinet. I mean, I pushed initially to be chancellor rather than business secretary, but that was never going to be possible under the terms of the agreement with the Tories. So I think there was a problem right from the very beginning. You know, there were particular things that could have been done differently. I mean, I did accept some weakening of labor rights, and you know, people could be dismissed if they've been in work for 1 year rather than 2 years. It doesn't make an enormous difference, but I think I probably shouldn't have conceded that. But the big controversial things, like the sale of the Royal Mail, were attacked at the time, but I think have been vindicated historically. The reforms we did on student finance, which caused a lot of damage to the Lib Dems over fees, weren't, I think, primarily the way we designed it in my department, but because of the pledge that the party had made before the election. But the policy we introduced, which was effectively a system of graduate income tax, was reasonable and fair and protected low-earning graduates.
Yeah. And obviously after that election, that was a very controversial election in 2015, and the Lib Dems lost quite a lot of seats. And you lost your seat in Twickenham. How did that feel? And then why did you decide to then come back and try and take it again in 2017?
Well, I think a lot of us were very angry about what happened in 2015. You know, we can explain it in all kinds of ways. And people have often said it was because we were in the coalition, but that's not true, because until a few months or indeed a few weeks before the election, it looked as if the Lib Dems were going to come back with about 30 seats, which would have given us a still key role in Parliament. What happened was that the Conservatives made a devastatingly effective attack on us in the election campaign, and you know, basically argued that unless you vote Conservative in places like Twickenham, you're going to get the Labour Party and the SNP in government, and Ed Miliband wasn't particularly popular. So a lot of us lost our seats because of that, rather than because we'd been in the coalition. And I suppose I felt I wanted to get my home back, and I felt, you know, the least I could do was to try and win back the seat for the party, which I've done, and it's now a sort of safe Lib Dem seat.
And if you have any piece of advice for your successor, I think, is it Munira Wilson who seated you in Twickenham?
Yes, I haven't interfered with her. You know, she's a very good MP. She's working hard. Seems to be quite popular, and I don't think that it's a very good idea for you know, MPs when they retire to become backseat drivers. So I let her get on with it. The one thing I suppose I did tell her, that you really got to spend a lot of time on building up your base in the constituency, taking advice surgeries seriously, attending to local issues. These things matter these days. And she's done that, and as far as I can see, has been a very good MP.
And you were a leader, weren't you, after, I think it was 20...
Yes, I took over
yeah.
in 2017 when I came back, and I did a couple of years. You know, we had quite a serious problem because we had 2 bad general election results. We only had 12 MPs, very difficult to get called in Parliament, very difficult to get on the national news. Very frustrating. The one big positive thing was of course the campaign against Brexit, and the Lib Dems were leading in that movement. I was heavily involved in it, in all the big rallies and so on. But ultimately, you know, we lost the argument. While I was leader, we had started to make quite a good comeback. We had very good local election results in 2019. I think we won about 700 seats. We did very well in the European elections, and I was hoping to hand over a recovering party to Joe Swinson when I stepped down. But you know what happened. It wasn't a great outcome.
Did you know that there would, or did you have a good suspicion that there would be a general election? And then do you regret not staying to fight that election now you know what's happened?
Well, that is a historically question. I mean, if I had stayed, we probably wouldn't have pushed for an early election, and you know, maybe Brexit would, if not stopped, would have been substantially modified. But it's easy to be wise in hindsight.
Yeah. And you're quite known, I think, infamously during your time as business secretary about tuition fees and tripling them from £3,000 to £9,000. I don't know whether you know about this. There's been quite, heavy rumours that the government are going to try and lower the salary of the graduates, start paying back their student loan. Do you think that's the right approach to take?
No, that would be very wrong. In fact, one of the main things I did when I was the business secretary was to actually lift the thresholds, and that matters. Well, the so-called trebling of fees, it was actually a doubling, but we gave discretion to universities to go beyond that. It was inevitable. I mean, it was going to happen under any government. There had been a report commissioned by the outgoing Labour government, Peter Mandelson, and the Tories, which would actually have involved fees going up potentially to 15,000 in some cases. But I adopted a different approach, and we kept the upper limit, and we concentrated on trying to improve the payment system so that low-earning graduates didn't pay anything or paid very little. And that was why we fixed the threshold at quite a high level. So if the government goes back on that, that would be quite a serious blow to young graduates going into professions that aren't very high earning, say working in a science laboratory or as a trainee teacher or whatever. I think would be a very bad backward move. The one thing the government should be doing is cutting the interest rate. There's no justification for having a high interest rate on student loans. It was insisted on at the time by the Treasury, but the economic logic was very questionable. So that's what they should be doing.
Moving on a bit, is it true that you were actually offered a place in the House of Lords? You offered a peerage?
Well, it is true that when I left, when I lost my seat, I could have gone to the House of Lords at that point, but I didn't want to, and I thought it was more important to stay out of Parliament and fight to win my seat in an election, which I did. And having gone through that, there's no prospect that the Tory government would offer me a peerage, and I'm not terribly interested anyway. I mean, I've got other things to do. And I think the whole system has become very corrupted. You pay money to a political party, you get a peerage. That's not an acceptable way to run a democracy.
You also have a new book out, I think, called China, Engage, Avoid the New Cold War. To someone who hasn't read the book, what is the general argument that you put across?
Well, I've got two books out. One is called Money and Power, which is a sort of economic history, really. It's about leading political figures who changed the way we do economic policy, about going from Alexander Hamilton through to Roosevelt, and then Ludwig Erhard, Margaret Thatcher, and Deng Xiaoping. But my most recent book is actually called The China Conundrum. It's a sort of better version of the pamphlet that you just described. And it really makes the case for constructive engagement with China. They, of course, have a different system. There are human rights issues, but we have to get a working relationship with a country that has got the biggest economy in the world, is almost certainly going to be, the superpower of the next 10, 20 years. And it's stupid to sort of turn our back on them. We've got to work with them. And my experience in government was that you can do that.
And just to kind of end it off, what do you see in the future for the Lib Dems and also just for liberalism in general?
Well, I think gradual recovery for the Lib Dems. It's not going to be a spectacular breakthrough, but I think we are on the way back. I think it will happen because we will get more what are called blue wall seats, like Amersham, Cheshire and Amersham, that we won in the by-election. There are probably about 20 of those in different, mostly in the south of England, some in the north, where the Lib Dems are the alternative to the Conservatives. Labour are a long way behind in third place. And when there is a swing against the government, the Lib Dems will be the beneficiary and will win those seats, as we did in Twickenham when I came in. In the meantime, I think the Lib Dems will make inroads in local government. We've done this in a spectacular way back in 2019. We used to run big cities, you know, Liverpool, Newcastle, Sheffield, others, Bristol amongst the others. It's more difficult where the Labour Party are the dominant party, but elsewhere, I think the Lib Dems will continue to make inroads in local government. I hope that we have some kind of tactical alliance with the Greens and with the Labour Party that will make it more possible to have a common front against a rather unpleasant and incompetent Tory government. So those are the steps that will get the Lib Dems back into being a significant national party.
Okay, brilliant. That's the end. Thank you, Vince, for coming on and for talking to me. Is there anything that you'd like to say before we end it?
Fine. That's
okay,
fine with me.
all right.